My name is Hank Knight. I'm director of the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And along with my colleagues at Keene State College, I am pleased to welcome all of you to this evening's program. Before I introduce our speaker, I do want to ask you to help me greet some special members of our community tonight. First off, President Helen Giles G., our leader, is right over here. And we'd like you to say hello to Jan and Rick Cohen, special friends of the college. They're sitting here in front. With their help, the Cohen Center does its important work, and they have helped the college have a still new academic chair in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, whom you will hear from in a moment. We also want you to greet Bruce and Deborah August. Their commitments to the college are spread particularly to students in our honors program, and Peggy Walsh is here, who's the director of that program, but we're delighted for their support. They're also parents of a junior named Casey. Now, I know I'm running the risk of embarrassing people by singling folks out to introduce to you, but the Augusts are here. Let them wave their hands. Say hello. And I have it on good authority that I'm safe doing this tonight because Casey is in Ireland with study abroad. So, you know, please, Casey's friends, don't tell on me. The Augusts are particularly helpful to us. Bruce is the president and CEO of the William T. Morris Foundation, and you'll see that name in a number of places. But tonight, think of the faces on these two people. They're our friends, and we want you to get to know them. Now, one of the other dangers of singling people out like this is that I risk making it seem that only a few people are special. But there is a large gathering of very special folks who are always special every night we gather, and those are Keene State College students. Let's say hello to them. Now, I picked up on the theme of friendship for a reason. You see, friendship is an incredibly important gift, and one of its privileges is introducing treasured friends to treasured friends. I have that opportunity tonight. Tonight's speaker is not only the newest member of our Holocaust and Genocide Studies faculty at Keene State College. He's become an important friend for all of us who've gotten to know him since his arrival this past August. As the inaugural chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Jim Waller fills an important niche at our college, offering courses primarily in genocide studies, yet with an integral grounding in the study of the Holocaust and the questions that this catastrophic era raises for all of us who live in its shadows. Jim's academic training is in social psychology. His work has led him to explore the personal and interpersonal factors that lead human beings to do evil things. And over the years, his research has addressed the root causes of racism in this country and perpetrator behavior in the Holocaust and in other forms of human atrocity. Indeed, his research has been recognized worldwide, with his book, Becoming Evil, serving as a standard text in the field of genocide studies. In addition to his work with us at Keene State, Jim continues as an affiliated scholar for the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, an international educational effort that works with government officials from around the world, helping them to learn to recognize and respond to issues of genocide in our world. So as you no doubt recognize, Jim's credentials are exceptional. But if you ask his students, or those of us who work with him on a daily basis, what you're probably going to hear is not a recital of those credentials. You'll hear us speak of things that are much more personal and relational. Jim is a wonderfully supportive friend and colleague who brings a depth of humanity and wisdom to some of the most important work anybody could do. He can be playful and serious at the same time, teasing out critical connections between how we become who we are and how we treat other people. He can be probing and exact. At the same time, he can be expansive and creative. Whether he is working with critical reports about troubling issues on the other side of the world, or leading a class discussion for timid first-time students. In short, Jim Waller is a special person, and I know I speak for my colleagues at the college when I say to this circle of friends gathered here, we are proud to claim him as one of us. Please welcome the Cohen Chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College, our friend and our colleague, Dr. James Waller.
Thanks, Hank. Thank you. Thank you, Hank, for an overly generous introduction, but thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time to be here tonight as well. Hank also didn't mention that this is the third lecture in this lecture series, Genocide Awareness Lecture, and so a couple things I'll start with by saying I'm pretty confident. Given that this is the third lecture in the series, I'm pretty confident in saying tonight you'll leave here and say, this is one of the 3 best lectures you've ever heard in this entire series, so I feel good about that. I also feel confident in kind of affirming some of what Hank said, and certainly parroting it back to him as well, and my pride in being here and being part of this community this year as well. And I think of that, and it kind of hit me in a couple of ways today, that, you know, today I taught my course in genocide, a 200-level course, and 36 students, I think about 12 of those 36, had gone this weekend on a trip sponsored by the Cohen Center to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. And today was, for me, the best class we've had all semester because of that center, because of that trip, and the Cohen Center's commitment to it. And to see the way that learning comes to life when these students were connecting their time in D.C. to what we were doing today was incredible. And I left that class thinking, I'm very, very lucky to be here. And probably the happiest thing I'm most happy about tonight is knowing that I'm not visiting a place like this, and I'm getting on a plane to go back home somewhere else tomorrow, but that this is home. And that I have the great fortune tomorrow of waking up and going back to my office in the Mason Library by Paul Vinson, a wonderful colleague and office mate, and being there and knowing that that's what I'll do day after day after day. And I thank all of you for the things you've done to contribute to give me that opportunity. So tonight what I want to share with you and talk a bit about is 2 things. This was a challenging talk for me to kind of structure and figure out what I want to say and how I want to say it. So what I'm going to do is combine the 2 hats that I've tended to wear over the past several years in the field of genocide studies, and that's the hat of an academic and the hat of a activist as well. So tonight, our time together in the next 3 hours we have are going to focus on students just fell out of their chairs. Focus on 2 questions. One is a question of genocide awareness, and this will be kind of the academic portion of some thoughts I want to share with you tonight. What is genocide? And perhaps most importantly, what are the current at-risk areas for mass atrocity? Where do we see? I mean, how have we thought about genocide historically? What are its defining characteristics and features? And again, taking that information to apply it to Where should we be worried about today? Because clearly we know that the Holocaust was not a one-time event. Clearly we know that never again has not had much meaning in world history since that time. So where are we worried about today? And that'll lead us into the activist portion, which is to ask an important question. Who has the responsibility and leverage to prevent genocide and mass atrocity? Where does that fall? On whose watch does this take place? In what degree are we responsible for using the leverage we have to prevent genocide and mass atrocity? So this would be the activist side of where I want to finish tonight. But let's start first with the question of what genocide is, and I'm going to frame that in the broadest possible context, and that context is social conflict in human history. So it doesn't start much more broadly than this. But what can we know and what can we understand about social conflict in human history? I think there are a lot of things. One is to recognize that for all of human history, this has been a ubiquitous feature of how we relate or misrelate to each other. That social conflict has defined very much who we are and how we've structured our places in the world today. Many of you recognize the lithograph to the left-hand side of this slide. It's the story of Cain and Abel. This story is foundational in the Hebrew tradition, the Christian tradition, the Islamic tradition. So whether you believe the story to be true or mythological or an allegory, it's a very important part of how many people in the world have shaped their understanding of who they are and their place in the world. Cain and Abel, Hebrew scriptures tell us, are the sons of Adam and Eve. Cain and Abel make a sacrifice to God, and for whatever reason, probably having to do with intention or motivation, God looks with favor upon Abel's sacrifice and with disfavor upon Cain's sacrifice. And the scriptures go on to say then that at some point in the future, as you see in this picture, Cain falls upon his brother Abel in the field and kills him. I had known this story for as long as I knew stories growing up. But it wasn't until about 10 or 12 years ago when I was reading something Elie Wiesel wrote about this story that an important point about it struck me. Wiesel says 2 men here in human history, and one of them become a killer. And his point was, this is the first time death appears in the world in this understanding. And death could have come into the world any number of ways: famine, pestilence, plague, heart attack, disease, the most common way, accident. But the first time death makes its appearance, it's in the form of murder. 2 men, and one of them becomes a killer. I think in many ways, and I put a few data points up here that I won't read through, you can read them, but in many ways, this has kind of set us off on a history of social conflict that's been a very ubiquitous part of human relations. When I see this slide, I think of 3 quotes that I think are important. One comes from Leon Trotsky. Trotsky once said, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." And you understand the power of that quote is to say, even if you have no interest whatsoever in war, you don't want to know anything about it, war has an interest in you. You don't have a choice to sit by and not be affected by war. Many of you are of an age where you can almost say you've spent your entire life in a country that at some point, every day of your life, has been at war. So I think it's important for us to understand the ways in which conflict is interested in us and affects us, even if we're not interested in conflict. I think the other quote I think of when I see this slide comes from Winston Churchill, who said, "The story of the human race is war." That's a wonderful quote, because again, if you think about it, if you gave an assignment to students and said, you need to tell the story of how we came to be who we are today, our language distribution, the nation-state boundaries, even distribution of diseases, what's the best lens to tell that story of who we are today? I think you're hard-pressed to find a better lens than war. If you tell me you have to write a history of humankind and you can do it through one lens, I'm not sure you can find a better one than war in terms of helping us understand how we've come to be the way we are today. And then finally, I look at this slide and I think of a quote from Plato who said, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." And this is a depressing quote, and I promise, we'll finish on a much more upbeat note, but we're going through some dark stuff now at the beginning. Only the dead have seen the end of war. Again, understand the power of that. That of all the constants and all the changes in human life, here's one constant. We're all going to live in a time where war is part of the human condition. Many of us hope we can, at some point, say we live in a country that's not at war in our lifetime. Only the dead have seen the end of war. So of all the things, if your great-great-great-grandparents came back to visit, of all the things you'd have difficulty talking about, iPads and fashion and music and everything else, there probably is one constant upon which you can draw. They lived at a time of war, and they were likely impacted, or at least knew someone in their family who was impacted by war. And when Plato says only the dead have seen the end of war, there's a literal truth to that as well. If we look at war-related deaths in the 20th century, we see a number over 100 million. That's more than 5 times the 19th century, more than 10 times the 18th century. Now again, we look at a slide like this and we think, well, that's certainly all because of technology. We can actually partition out some of the effects of technology, and what we see is here that there's a tremendous increase over time in actual numbers of conflicts. So even if we hadn't gotten better weaponry and technology to kill each other with, the number of increases in conflicts would still indicate that we'd still see the same type of steep upward trend in the number of wartime deaths. There's probably nothing else we inflict on each other that causes the devastation and loss that war and conflict cause. Tonight, we're going to focus our attention on some things that I think we can call worse than war. Mass atrocities directed at civilian populations. Now, here's something important that I want you to understand before you leave tonight. The nature of warfare has changed drastically. At the beginning of the 20th century, 90% of casualties of war were military personnel. Combatant soldiers accounted for 90% of the people who died in war at the beginning of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 21st century, 90% of the casualties of war are civilians, most of whom are women and children. The sad truth of today's world is that the least safe people in conflict are the people not fighting the conflict. They are the civilians, again, most often women and children, who are the innocent bystanders in many cases in the conflict, but now account for the greatest number of war-related casualties in conflict. And again, it's a painful truth that the safest place you can be in armed conflict today is to be a soldier. That doesn't minimize the men and women who serve on the front lines for our country or any other country, but it tells you that warfare has changed. And the people who are most at risk at warfare today are civilians. So when we think about mass atrocities committed against civilians, we've had to develop legal terminologies and legal understandings for much of these. The 3 different crimes of mass atrocity that we typically speak of are, first, war crimes. War crimes occur in times of war. Again, crimes directed against civilians. Crimes against humanity, which may occur in war or in times of peace. But in crimes against humanity, these are widespread human rights abuses, typically with no intent to wipe out an entire group of people, however that group is defined. But what makes genocide different is that genocide has a stated intent to exterminate a group of people based on their membership in a group. In terms of an international legal framework, we've identified genocide as crimes against national, ethnical, racial, or religious groups. Crimes committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the members of those groups. Now, there are a lot of things that are dissatisfying about that international definition from the UN Genocide Convention, and in our courses with our students, we spend a lot of time unpacking those. But basically, what I want you to understand from this slide is to say that when we talk about mass atrocities against civilians who are not part of conflict but on the sidelines of conflict, it can typically take one of these 3 forms. And again, what we want to focus on tonight is specifically the crime of genocide. And we could spend a lot of time here talking about the legal aspects of genocide and how it's defined, how it could be better defined. But this is how I've come to think of it over the course of my time in the field. One is to say that much of the concern of human rights is a concern over what I would call to have. Okay, so you could be interested in human rights, and you're interested in people's right to have a vote. You're interested in people's right to have social and political equality. You're interested in people's right to their own body. You're interested in people's right to water, to food, to education. And that field of human rights is obviously absolutely important to how we understand our world today. But what's different about genocide is that genocide is not an issue of to have. Genocide is an issue of to be. It is an issue not of worrying about whether or not people have the right to vote or the right to access to water or health care or education. It's simply a question about whether or not people have the right to be. And when a political, social, or religious group in power in a country have started to raise this question, does this person have the right to be? Simply because they're a member of this group, they're raising questions of genocidal intent. Raoul Hilberg is the founding figure, really, of Holocaust studies, late of the University of Vermont. And Hilberg once said that what happens in genocide is you think of a group of people, and again, a political, social, religious group in power, and they simply would say about a group of people, these people no longer have a right to exist or to live among us. And so we push the people out, we force them into another country, or perhaps we ghettoize them in our country. But in genocide, you take off the final part of that statement, and it becomes, these people do not have a right to exist or live, period. And when a group in power makes that decision, they've made the decision to commit genocide. Again, what states have been given, and we try to codify and understand this in international norms as well, is states have been given the responsibility to protect the people that live in their state. In genocide, the state waives the responsibility to protect and replaces it with an obligation in their mind to kill, to exterminate, to extinguish. So when that decision has been made, when we've moved beyond, and these aren't easily separable in some cases. I mean, many early stages of genocide begin with this discussion of to have and removing rights that people ought to have. But when it gets to a question of to be, we've gotten to that question of genocidal violence. The 20th century was, unfortunately, a century marked by a lot of tremendous advances, but also marked by a lot of tremendous pain. In the field of genocide studies, it's commonly called the 20th century the age of genocide because of the range of devastation that we inflicted on each other during this century. And again, it's not that genocide didn't exist before the 20th century, but in the 20th century, in a morally inverted sense of the word, we got very good at genocide. We perfected the tools of persecution, of killing and extermination that previous centuries had perhaps thought of and tried to implement at times, but nowhere with the success as the 20th century. It begins with the destruction of a native Southwest African population of Hereros in 1904, the murder of 1.5 million Armenians by Turks between 1915 and 1923. We are coming up soon on April 24th, which is the International Day of Commemoration for the Armenian Genocide, a vitally important day of commemoration because Armenian communities throughout the world today still have to face the reality that the official policy of the government of Turkey is to deny that this genocide ever occurred. So victims and their families are re-traumatized generation after generation after generation in having to again assert their own victimization. It's also going to be an intriguing April 24th because it's President Obama's third April 24th in office, and he has pledged in his presidential campaign to call the Armenian experience what it was, genocide. To this point, he has yet to do so because it has some very sensitive, as you would guess, geopolitical realities with Turkey. And Turkey threatens to withdraw military bases from the U.S. In Turkey if they're ever accused of genocide. Now, oddly enough, and this gives you some sense of the weight of the word, Turkey seems perfectly fine with presidential statements that talk about massacres, human rights abuses, murders, deportations, exterminations, but the G word, genocide, has taken on enough weight that that's what Turkey is afraid of a sitting president to use. President Obama has pledged he will do that. The Armenian community in America waits now for the third time on April 24th to see if that will happen. The implementation of Soviet man-made famine by Stalin in the Ukraine in 1932-33. This is a genocide that has seen an explosion of recent scholarship. Estimates of death toll in 32-33 between 5 and 6 million Ukrainian kulaks who die not because of some natural disaster that brings about drought, but because of Stalin's requisition of grain from their territories and his refusal to allow them to travel elsewhere to find food to replenish the grain that they had lost in the requisition. Reading the stories of any victims of genocide is heartbreaking, obviously, and it's very painful to go through. And in some ways, as you work in the field, students, faculty, and others, you have some sense of secondary trauma just as you work through much of it. But I think the stories in the Ukraine of reading about people starving to death, about parents who take children who have died and dismember them and boil them to make soup so they can find a way to live another day. And all of this, no natural causes, man-made causes. A political oppressor has decided this group of people no longer has the right to be. And as we talked about in genocide class today, these are situations of extremity that don't reveal the best of anyone involved in them, or very seldom reveal the best of anyone involved in them. The Holocaust of 1939 to 1945, 2 out of every 3 of Europe's Jews die in this 6-year time period, specifically targeted for extermination by Nazi policies and practices. After the Holocaust, we see the phrase, never again. It's interesting to think about the origin of this particular phrase. Raoul Hilberg, again, I mentioned earlier, says that he first saw it at liberation at the camp of Buchenwald. And a prisoner who was being liberated had held up the phrase, written in Russian, never again. Hilberg thinks that this was planted there by a Russian communist and served some other purposes to it. But wherever it came from, this 2-word phrase, never again, caught on quickly. And it caught on very seriously. And today, again, if you visit the U.S. Holocaust Museum or elsewhere, you can buy T-shirts with the phrase, never again. You can buy rocks with the phrase engraved in it. You can buy bumper stickers. Anything you want to with this phrase you can buy. And the phrase itself is evocative, and it's a wonderful phrase. And it's what we want to believe, that never again is something like this going to occur. But as one journalist said, never again really only has meaning if by it you mean never again would Germans kill Jews in Europe in the 1940s. If that's what never again means, you're right on. If, though, you take never again to mean never again would we see genocidal violence on this scale, that's where it seems to be mistaken. So in many ways, I think of it as ever again. We've seen since the end of the Holocaust, which really, pulled together a strong anti-genocide constituency throughout the world. We've still seen genocide and other forms of mass atrocity in Indonesia, Bangladesh, Burundi, Cambodia, East Timor, Guatemala, Sri Lanka, Iraq, Rwanda, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Nepal. You add together the death tolls from the 20th century, and you have 60 million lives lost at the hands of genocidal violence. Again, when you work in a field, you tend to start to think what you work in is more important than other things. And I certainly don't ever want to be arrogant enough to start to have that feeling or communicate that. But you're hard-pressed to find what types of things in 1 century have taken 60 million lives that could have been avoided, that were human-made disasters, where humans decided to kill other humans in large numbers over an extended period of time, 60 million people in 1 century. The challenging thing about genocide studies is you want it to end at some point. You want to, and I think Hank would say this about the Cohen Center, we would love to not have to have these things exist, that at one day we could say, this was the final genocide, it ended here, we learned our lesson, there's no need for additional education, there's no need for remembrance, because we've learned what we had to learn from this, we've grown from it, and never again is absolutely a reality. I wish we could say in some ways about the 20th century that it was the age of genocide, and there's not one to follow. But in many ways, we have significant areas of concern in the world today that make it look as if the 21st century is not off to much of a brighter future. I promise there's parts of this that will be inspiring and get us excited about our place in the world. We're not there yet, but give me 10 minutes, we'll be there. As of 2009, one of the things that I do, Hank mentioned my role with the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, is I stay abreast of briefings from around the world about sites of conflict, and I'm part of a group that tries to feed much of this data into a theoretical model to help us understand what countries are greatest at risk for genocide in a given year. These countries you see represented on the screen here are based on data sets from 2009. There are 7 risk factors for genocide that we won't go into here, but if you have questions afterwards we can discuss. But we can take information about a country's economic interdependence, about a country's ruling party, about a country's ideology, about press releases in countries and so on, and we can start to get a pretty good idea based on what we know from previous cases of genocide, how likely is a country to be at risk for genocidal violence. Again, our most recent data set suggests these 9 countries. Sudan, which is the largest country in Africa, Myanmar, Burma, which actually is the highest at-risk country today. We do not know the scale of human rights abuses or mass atrocities going on in Burma now because it has become a closed society. And that's kind of one of the final warning signs for countries on the verge of genocidal violence is the country closes itself off. Human rights groups are kicked out, foreign journalists and press are banned, and this is much of what we've seen recently in Myanmar, Burma. Somalia, another country at risk, Iran, China, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, heartbreakingly, a country high at risk, heartbreaking because Rwanda tore itself apart in 1994. 800,000 victims in 100 days. You can take Auschwitz at its highest functioning capacity. You won't find a rate of death anywhere approaching that. And what's striking about Rwanda, 800,000 victims in 100 days, is not just the frenzy and the rate of killing, but the fact that the vast majority of it was done by hand, face to face. Machete, hacking people to death. Masu, clubs with nails driven through them, just beating people to death, kicking people to death. When I interview alleged and convicted perpetrators in Rwanda and I ask them about their recollection of experiences on the ground in Rwanda, one of the very first things they most often say is exhaustion. The killing was hard, but they did it 20 hours a day, day after day after day for 100 days. It's heartbreaking to see Rwanda, a beautiful country, where Rwandans say, God wanders the world during the day, but at night he comes back to sleep at home in Rwanda. When you see the country, you think that could very well likely be true. But it's a country that hasn't reconstructed itself from the genocide, that is probably more dictatorship today than democracy, and it's remained high as a country at risk now for several years. And finally, Saudi Arabia. Also included on this map is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Not included on this map are 3 recent cases with which many of you will be familiar, certainly with at least one of them, that are important for us to discuss as well. Burundi is a country that has unfortunately had a fairly recent up and down history of genocidal violence, beginning in 1972 with mass killings of Hutu by a Tutsi-dominated army. If these categories, Hutu and Tutsi, sound familiar to you, it's because they are from Rwanda. And as Rwandans will say, when Burundi eats a bad meal, Rwanda gets the indigestion. I mean, Rwanda feels the effects of it, feels the consequences of it. In '93, mass killings of Tutsi by Hutu civilians. And then, as we're seeing fairly common throughout Africa and some places in the Middle East, post-election violence rearing its head in late 2010. Today in Burundi, there's persecution of opposition leaders, there's persecution of journalists, persecution of civilians. One of our close friends at Auschwitz, as I'll say in a few moments, at the Auschwitz Institute, we bring government policymakers and U.S. military personnel to Auschwitz to learn about genocide, warning signs, what they can do to make a difference. And one of the graduates of our very first seminar, Alice Nizumukunda, returned to Burundi, her home country, basically rose to the equivalency of the vice presidency in Burundi, was well positioned to make a difference, but today has had to flee to Tanzania in fear of her life because she's part of what Burundi has now labeled an opposition party, the Alliance for Democratic Renewal. We hear from Alice about once every other week when she can get access to the internet in Tanzania to give us an update about what's happening in Burundi. And again, when you hear from her, you recognize that perhaps Burundi didn't make our map a year ago when we had all the data in hand. But one of the things we recognize about genocidal violence and mass atrocities is the speed and rapidity with which it can happen. And so there's great concern today about Burundi. The Ivory Coast is another area of concern, which in late December 2010 had tremendous amounts of post-election violence. The UN has expressed its concern about the incidence of violence and human rights violations in the Ivory Coast, including genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And probably most recently, what you most be familiar with is Libya. The world has moved incredibly quickly on situations in Libya. Violence began in Libya in early February of 2011. By February 26th, the UN Security Council, in a unanimous vote, 15-0, referred Libya to the International Criminal Court. Now, a lot of things striking about this. One is the UN Security Council, 15-0, has 5 permanent members and 10 rotating members. The 5 permanent members are the US, France, Britain, Russia, and China. They hardly ever agree on anything. So unanimous votes are very, very rare. And if something goes through a certain number of votes to 0, it's because one of those 5 or 2 of those 5 have typically abstained. The fact that all 15 members of the UN Security Council referred Libya to the International Criminal Court for investigation so quickly and with such unanimity was just unheard of. I still remember the first time it came across my computer screen that this had happened. I thought certainly there had been a typo. The UN Security Council never goes 15-0 on anything, where to order out for lunch, let alone where to intervene in the world, but it did it in February 26. By March 3rd, Luis Moreno Ocampo, the head chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, had referred and had said about Libya that the ICC was going to open an investigation into Libya. As you know, late March, just these past couple of weeks, the alliance has engaged in military intervention to establish a no-fly zone and to aid in deliveries of humanitarian assistance to Libya. Libya is a fascinating case study for those of us in genocide studies because no point in recent history has the world moved with the rapidity that it's moved in Libya. I mean, the UN Security Council never moves as quickly on anything. The ICC never moves this quickly on anything. The world never moves this quickly on anything to intervene militarily. And what's frustrating about it from the standpoint of genocide is that every day you delay, people die in genocide. So bureaucratic delays because you didn't get the right signature here and you can't get it until next week, you measure that in thousands of deaths in genocidal violence. So on one hand, it's great about Libya that we've moved so quickly. And it looks like, and Ocampo says, and President Obama says, we have to protect civilians. And that's why we're there, and that's why we're doing it quickly. And on the surface of it, you're thrilled because it looks like, wow, we finally learned the lesson. When people start killing civilians, we have to intervene and stop that. When a state has given away its responsibility to protect, we have to step in and take over the responsibility to protect and intervene. But as many of you know, there have been deep and I think significant questions about motivations in Libya. I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask the question, why is it that Libyan civilians are more valuable and command more attention and more military commitment than the civilians of Darfur? Men and women who've suffered through 6 years of genocide in Darfur are sure as heck asking that question. You got in Libya in 2 weeks? 6 years we've been victims of genocide. We've got nothing from the Security Council. We've been referred to the ICC. They're still investigating. Military intervention so that humanitarian assistance can be delivered? Why don't we get that? Some people answer that Libya's position is more important because its disintegration threatens other Arab regimes. Other people have been more forthright and said, Libya's oil rich. Sudan is not. Darfur is not. Sudan and Darfur find themselves at the bottom of the geopolitical pecking order. As we meet here tonight, I think actually just a few moments ago, President Obama is delivering a national address about Libya. So again, on one hand, you take great encouragement that we've acted quickly. We're going to help, I think, in some important fundamental ways. We will aid the protection of civilians in Libya. But you're still left with some nagging questions about, are all humans human? Are some humans more human than other humans because of what they set on in terms of resources, because of where they set in terms of geopolitical strategy? So again, in genocide studies, this will certainly be an important case study for us. So now let's talk about the second part, the activist part. What can we do in terms of genocide prevention? Because I hope one of the things you've picked up from our first half hour together is just sense that, genocide is an age-old problem. It's not going away. You could argue that with increasing population growth and corresponding increasing scarcity of resources, the problem is only going to get worse. And I'd be inclined to agree with that. Someone once said the only difference between an optimist and a pessimist is that a pessimist has more data. And I think we do have the data in genocide studies to suggest this is going to be an ongoing problem and probably an increasingly severe ongoing problem. So the question for us tonight is, who has the responsibility, and I want to use the concept of leverage, to prevent genocidal violence? I'm going to argue that this can take place on several levels, but I want to finish it with the level of you and I. That there are some things, certainly in responding to genocide, that only some of us can do. Some of us in positions to respond to genocide that are different positions than other people, absolutely. But there are some things that all of us can do. And what I want to argue is that if we all do all the things that we can do, I do absolutely believe that that's going to make a fundamental difference. So I'm going to talk about prevention at kind of these 5 levels. Formal legal and political institutions, non-governmental organizations, mass media, social activism, and then what I'll call personal activism. So let's look first at the formal legal and political institutions. I'm not going to give you, obviously, an exhaustive survey of everything that's going on at this level, but I do want to give you an idea here of some people have recognized the problem. And some people are trying to make a difference to address the problem of genocide and mass atrocity. At the level of the United Nations, although it's very easy to be critical of the UN, and certainly when I visit Rwanda, the UN and UNAMIR, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Rwanda, is not a well thought of force. UN involvement in Rwanda was not well thought of. Many people in Rwanda believe that the killing would have been less had the UN actually not been present. When I speak with Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica, the site of a 1995 genocide at the hand of Bosnian Serbs, their least favorite people in the world, I think even less so than Bosnian Serbs, are UN personnel. And again, their belief is without the involvement of the UN, the killing and the loss in Srebrenica would not have been near what it ended up being in 1995. So it's very easy, I think in many ways, to criticize the role and the presence of the UN, but at the end of the day, the UN is what we have set up to try and make never again a reality. I mean, it's in large part the reason for the existence of the organization after the League of Nations. So some of the things that we've suggested with the UN is that there are some things the UN could perhaps tweak that would make it more effective. I mean, the UN is a large institution. If you've ever even visited the UN, you know it's got tremendous heft. And when things have tremendous heft and weight, they don't tend to be very agile. Unfortunately, in situations of genocidal violence, you need some institution with the heft and with the agility to respond quickly. Right now, the UN has the heft, but doesn't really have the agility to respond that quickly, although Libya shows us when they want to, and when enough superpowers want them to, they can make the move. One of the things that some organizations have suggested is the development of a United Nations Emergency Peace Service, UNEPS. This would be a first-in, first-out force that's standing, that's always ready, 15 to 18,000 troops supporting it, and it can be on the ground within 24 to 48 hours of the suspicion of mass atrocity, and it will be there until the UN has developed the forces necessary to come in and make a difference. To this point, the UN has resisted this, but I think it's something in the next 5 to 10 years we're very likely to see some movement on. Certainly, we've seen the development of the International Criminal Court as a positive way to demonstrate that perpetrators of genocide and mass atrocity won't commit their evil with impunity, that they will someday pay for what they've done. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to stop them from doing what they intend to do, but at least we have a standing court, a permanent court in place that will hold perpetrators responsible. We've certainly seen U.S. government responses. President Obama in 2008 said, when genocide is happening, we have to consider it as part of our interest, our national interest in intervening where possible. We've never had a sitting U.S. president even begin to suggest that intervening in genocide is in our national interest. I think the Obama administration has a broad view that recognizes that instability anywhere is a threat to stability everywhere. And it does seem in the U.S. at a political level that we're starting to recognize that as well. The Senate concurrent resolution you see here on the slide just passed last December was a resolution that recognized the United Nations has the U.S. has a national interest in helping to prevent and mitigate acts of genocide and other mass atrocities against civilians. So those, I think, are positive changes. I think we also see changes in terms of non-governmental organizations that have become involved in responding to genocide as well. As Hank mentioned in the introduction, for the past several years, I've had the fortune of being involved with the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. This is a nonprofit, non-governmental organization based in New York City that basically has said, rather than academics talking to other academics about what genocide is and how we should respond to stopping it, that maybe the best people for us to talk with about this are government policymakers from around the world, and more recently, U.S. Army military personnel. So 3 or 4 times a year, I travel to Auschwitz, and this coming April, my friend Chuck Anderton here from Holy Cross, College of the Holy Cross, will be traveling with us as well. 3 or 4 times a year, we go to Auschwitz, and we bring groups of 20 government policymakers from around the world, like Alice, our friend who came from Burundi, our U.S. Army majors, and for a week, we work with them on 3 questions. What is genocide? What are the warning signs? What can you do to make a difference? And I'm the curriculum developer now for those seminars. And what the seminars plan to do is try to put people who are going to be in positions of influence to help them understand what genocide is and what it looks like when it comes across. And let me give you one example, and then I'm going to show you a brief video clip. But the last time we were at the seminar in September, we're now working with the U.S. Army at Fort Leavenworth. So every Army major goes through the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. And every one of those majors in the Army will now come to Auschwitz, and they'll take our course for the week. And we tour the grounds of Auschwitz. We teach in Auschwitz in a former prisoner's barrack. And one of the majors had stopped in front of an exhibit at Auschwitz I that was a list of prisoners to be readied for deportation to Auschwitz. And he stood there at that list, and understand that all these majors who come through our program have all been through at least 2 or 3 different terms of deployment. So they have seen things that the rest of us have only read about or written about. And he stood there for a long time transfixed by this list, and I kind of caught him from the side and looked at him, and he's just in tears. And he's in tears because he realizes he's seen this list before. And he's seen it on a tour of duty, and it just didn't strike him that there was anything dangerous about lists of people being drawn up based on group identification and what that can lead to. But after his time at Auschwitz, and what he said to us in the debriefing was, next time I see that list, I know what the list means, and I know what the list can lead to. So again, we've tried to recognize that there are going to be some people in positions different than you and I that can have some different forms of leverage than the type of leverage you and I have. But what I want to emphasize is that doesn't excuse us. I mean, it still compels us to use the leverage we have in our settings. So this is a brief 2-minute video clip that shows you a little bit about what we do in Auschwitz and some of the people we do it with.
Genocide has caused the death of more human beings than all the wars and murders in history combined. After the Holocaust of European Jews in World War II, the international community said never again. And yet the bloodshed continues. Guatemala, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Burundi, East Timor, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan. It seems it cannot be stopped. The Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation believes that it can. AIPR is an independent, non-profit, non-governmental organization based in the United States and Poland that prevents genocide by identifying and training effective and committed leaders in 3 areas: government, military and academia. AIPR's newest program brings U.S. Army officers to the Holocaust site of Auschwitz in Poland for 7 intensive days of education and training in the history of genocide and the tools they can use to prevent it. Instructors for Auschwitz Institute seminars are leading scholars and policy practitioners who approach the issue from every angle: history, politics, psychology, diplomacy, international law, media, education, transitional justice and early warning. For many participants, the highlight of the seminar is the guided study tour of the extermination camps, led by experts from the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, AIPR's valued partner. The impact of this transformative experience cannot be overestimated. As they advance in their careers, some of them going on to become high-ranking commanders, these army officers will carry with them the knowledge that preventing mass atrocities is a critical part of every mission they go on. They will know the warning signs and they will be able to intervene to stop the bloodshed. The Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. We prevent genocide. Go to www.auschwitzinstitute.org to donate now and help us save lives.
I know there's a simpler way to do that and I couldn't find it. But anyway, AIPR is one of many organizations around the world that are trying to do this type of work. And again, they're in position to use leverage in a different way than many of us can do. Before I move off of this slide, I'd be remiss if I also didn't say, to kind of connect you a little bit to what we're doing here at the college, that we're starting to have some significant connections here as well. Kelsey Mogel is a major in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, who will be our first summer intern at the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. She'll also be joining us there in April for our upcoming seminar. Hank Knight and Paul Vincent have just returned from Jagiellonian University, you saw mentioned here in Krakow, Poland, where we're beginning to develop a partnership for our students, perhaps faculty, to have exchange situations in Jagiellonian as well. Mass media is another important tool, obviously, and we've certainly seen the way in recent global political protests and call for democracy that mass media can be used. I think we've seen similarly issues of social activism that are important. I've listed a few here. The Genocide Intervention Network I've always found fascinating because it started by 3 students from Swarthmore College who were majors in international studies and peace and conflict studies, and just felt that we weren't doing enough to respond to situations of genocide, particularly in Darfur. And these students today find themselves heading up the largest grassroots anti-genocide movement and organization in the U.S., and actually one of the largest in the world as well. The 1 Million Bones Project is a fascinating art project where an artist activist is planning to display 1 million bones made out of paper mache on the Mall in Washington, D.C., I believe in June 2012. And it will be a statement about the remembrance of victims in genocide and the importance of activism in the future. The Enough Project you probably have heard some about because of its role and its use of celebrity activism. George Clooney, Don Cheadle, Brad Pitt, and others who have been involved with the Enough Project. The Enough Project also has tried to help us understand, I think, an important part of the ways in which conflict products and minerals find their way into the things we use and to the things we purchase. This is a recent data slide from the Enough Project that evaluates companies, and the companies may be a bit difficult for you to see, but evaluates companies on the basis of what portion of the materials in their particularly electronics products come from areas of conflict. So I have an office printer by HP that actually does fairly well on enough criteria. I have an office computer by Dell that does a little bit less well. But it's an important reminder for us that some of the choices we make economically in terms of our purchasing have certainly significant implications for areas of conflict across the world as well. But I think the most important piece, and this is what I want you to think with me through tonight, is personal activism. What are your points of leverage that you have, and maybe you have and you alone have, and what's your responsibility to use those points of leverage? Social contagion theory is a fascinating social psychological theory that says within 3 degrees of influence, 3 degrees of relationship, we know 1,000 people to whom our statement or our opinion means something. Okay? Social media is probably ratcheting that number up as we speak. But 1,000 people within your sphere of influence to whom if you said something, what you say would carry some meaning. Some of you are what social contagion theorists call superconnectors. A superconnector is someone who just simply has an outsized influence. Some of you, regardless of your age or your standing in society, are superconnectors. What you say means something to more than, many times more than, 1,000 people. What's our responsibility to use that leverage? This is my first year here, so I'm going to take the liberty of introducing you to our 3 children and talking to you a little bit about where their points of leverage lie. This is my oldest son, Brennan. You can laugh, and you should. Since the age of 10, Brennan has thought it funny to make this face in every picture ever taken of him at family gatherings. We've let it go because, in truth, this is better than the face that's usually there. So it's fine. This is an improvement. It's an upgrade in some way, so we let it go. But you're hard-pressed to find a picture of him in the past 10 years that doesn't have this little grin/scowl attached to it. Cracks him up. The rest of us have just gotten used to it. Brennan has some points of leverage I don't have. He has people to connect with, people to impress, people to whom he means something and his opinions mean something that I don't have. One of the things we hope we've instilled in him is a sense of his responsibility to use those points of leverage regardless of how goofy he looks in pictures. This is my middle daughter, Hannah, who's now a senior in high school. This picture takes some background. We're in London. We're freezing, bitterly cold day. We're at the Tower of London. She goes into a restroom. She doesn't come out for about 15 minutes. We get worried. I think Patty went in with the camera, knowing something was up. Hannah's huddled under this heater to dry her hands that she just keeps staying under. She makes this face. She's goofy. It's genetic. It comes from me. But she has points of leverage that her brother doesn't have. She has points of leverage that we don't have. What we ask of her is that she use those points of leverage for social good, that she use social contagion for social good. This is our youngest son, Noah. This is the same trip in London. Noah's the world's pickiest eater. All we found that he could eat, and we ate here honestly 2 days a week, was Pizza Express, because he could eat these 6 dough balls. He doesn't like cheese on his pizza, but these 6 dough balls he lived for. He begged for us to take this picture because he wanted a picture for all posterity of his friend, the dough balls. He ate these twice a day for 7 days. I think, honestly, he's still constipated. It's been 3 years since the fact, and he's still struggling with it. Noah's a 7th grader. Love him more than anything in the world. Noah has points of leverage with his friends that I'll never have. He has points of leverage that, again, we ask him to be responsible for in terms of social good. Some of you, I told them, in exchange for those pictures, I'll show a good one. And this is my favorite one of them several years ago at Christmas. And I say it's my favorite, but if you look closely, you'll see it's also our orthodontist favorite, because evidently we were heavy into braces at this time. But this reminds me, as I get to this point, I think of this phrase for the title tonight, Our World, Our Watch. And I love this quote from Theodore Parker. He's a local. He's a Unitarian minister, leader of the abolitionist movement in Boston. There's this famous quote of his, probably not because you've read it from him, because you've heard it elsewhere, paraphrased. "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, my eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." And where have you heard this paraphrased? It's Martin Luther King. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." No other phrase did King use as often as he used this phrase in his speeches and his writings. But what I love about these phrases was pointed out by President Obama when he was speaking on the 40th anniversary of King's death, when he says, yes, the arm bends toward justice, but here's the thing. It does not bend on its own. It bends because each of us in our own ways put our hand on that arc and we bend it in the direction of justice. And I love the strength of that statement. If the arc of the universe does bend toward justice, it doesn't do it on its own. It's not passive. It may not be natural. But it does it because each of us in our way helps it bend. We give it the pressure. We apply our points of leverage. And I want you to understand that when perpetrators, potential perpetrators, think about committing mass atrocity, what they count on is they count on our ignorance. They count on our apathy. They count on our silence. They count on our indifference. And we have to realize that all of life is a series of choices. We can say yes or no, but we can't avoid saying one or the other. Being silent in the face of genocide and mass atrocity, perpetrators take as yes. They take as permission to commit the evil in which they're engaged. So what is it that we can do to make a difference? I want to make sure that when you leave here tonight, you have at least a rough idea of the types of things that can be done. I think one thing we can do is you can join and support an anti-genocide or humanitarian movement, organization, or campaign, like some of the ones I talked about earlier in social activism. You can support them monetarily. You can certainly join them and be active in them. We have an active Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Club here, and many times we partner with many of these groups in social activism efforts. Again, I think these things over time make a difference. And for too long, we've remained silent and we've remained indifferent, but over time, enough voices, I think, can make a difference. We can use the power of social contagion theory for social good. Keep informed and inform others about the events in the world through social networks, social media. I mean, the great thing now is that we don't necessarily have to make these connections. The connections have already been made. We've built them up over a lifetime of experiences. And the issue is, are we willing to use those connections as points of leverage to help people understand about the reality of genocide and mass atrocity, and about the fact that civilians are the least protected populations in zones of conflict today. Thirdly, we can shape political will by lobbying our senator, representative in the White House. Again, social activism has made this easy. If you dial 1-800-GENOCIDE tonight, you will be greeted by the tape-recorded voice of Zach Braff from the television show that I'm now blanking on. What's the show he produced? Scrubs? Produces and starred in on television. Zach Braff will take you through the talking points necessary to leave a message to your representative or your senator, voicing your opinion about genocidal violence, your preference on what should be done, and then you will simply type in your area code, zip code in which you live. You'll be connected directly to the voicemail box of your elected representative, and your voice there makes a difference. Again, I've sat in enough offices of elected representatives on the part of my own work in the Auschwitz Institute to know that they tally, they keep track of how many calls they get on different topics. And when you ask to see the tallies and you see genocide not appearing in the top 50 when violence is ongoing in Darfur, you recognize that your disappointment is not as much in them as elected officials, but it's in yourself and the people around you who've chosen not to exercise that voice to indicate What is your concern? What is it that you want your elected representatives working on? You can contact local newspapers, television, and radio concerning their coverage of genocide and mass atrocity. And finally, you can stay aware of the global implications of your economic choices. There are many programs now trying to commit people to purchase conflict-free products. But even if you can't purchase them, at least making companies aware of the fact that you're aware of where products come from and how often many of the pieces, especially in our electronics, come from conflict zones, I think those can be important. And finally, and I think it's always difficult because I do want you to leave here and I want you to have some sense of responsibility and some awareness of your own leverage, not asking that we do all of these things every day. I mean, I try to envision a world in which for 15 minutes a week, each of us, instead of being a bystander, we're an upstander in a significant way. For 15 minutes a week, we did something to inform other people, to challenge other people, to make our elected officials know that it's not appropriate and we're not willing to stand by and let civilians be targeted by mass destruction any longer. A world where we can make a difference with 15 minutes a week, I mean, that would be a world of difference if we simply committed to making it. And this is really the final thing I want you to leave you with tonight, is that it is a mess of a world. I can't keep up with the conflicts I have to keep up with as a comparativist. I want the world to take a time out so I can fully understand what's going on in Libya, what's going on in Burundi, what's going on in the Ivory Coast, and then once I'm up to speed, go, resume, start other conflicts if you like, but they simply crop up so often that it's difficult to stay on top of them. So it's a mess of a world, but it's a mess of a world that we've created. And I'm a strong believer in, if we've created it, we can decreate it. If we've constructed it, we can deconstruct it. If we've been the source of the problem, we can be the source of the solution. Unfortunately, though, there's no plan B. It's ours to fix. There's no supernatural hero is going to come in to do it. It's our mess. I think our responsibility to fix it. And what I hope for you tonight is that you think hard and long about the points of leverage you have where you can make a difference in a world where too many sections of it are beginning to tear itself apart. So thank you very much for your attention. I think we have time now for a few questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand, and Michelle has a microphone, and she will run around to make sure you're heard. Sure. No, thank you very much for the question. I think I got most of us going in and out. But the question is, are we at this point in our country kind of in a situation where we care less about what's going on around the world than perhaps we did in the 60s and 70s, and perhaps a little bit more self-absorbed? And I think there's some things to point to that, but I think there are also, again, I hope tonight I've pointed out some points of hope as well. One of the things to me that's a challenge is Peter Singer's a philosopher who's written about what he calls our circle of moral commitment. And his point is that when people fall within the circle of moral commitment, we feel a commitment to do something when they're in danger. For most of us, that circle of moral commitment certainly is family and friends that we know and people that are close to us here. If they're in danger, if they're in need, we'll do something very quickly to try to respond to it. But I think over time in history, we've seen cases where that circle of moral commitment has expanded and then contracts a bit, expands and contracts a bit. And maybe many of you in the 60s and 70s felt you lived at a time where the circle of moral commitment was just simply larger than it was today. And again, I understand that point to some degree, but the challenge for us is, how do we define the other? I mean, how do we define people in terms of our moral commitment who look different than we do, who believe differently than we believe, who eat differently than we eat, who are just different from us in some fundamental significant ways? Are they less worthy of moral consideration simply because of those differences? Romeo Dallaire was the UN commander on the ground in Rwanda, who every time he speaks raises that question. Is an African life worth anything less simply because it's African? You and I would say, no, of course not. But sometimes foreign policy and interest looks like, yes, it is worth less, because we don't hear about it. We don't care about it as much. Now, it's impossible for us to have an infinite universe or circle of moral commitment. The challenge is, can it grow? Can it expand? Are we doing things in education, in politics, in social media that encourage a growth of that? Or does it tend to be something a bit more xenophobic that starts to encourage a contraction of it? Again, despite what I do and who I work with and perpetrators I spend time interviewing, I'm a strong believer that we can make steps in that right direction to expand that universal moral commitment. And again, I hope what I've done tonight is try to lay out some of the ways we can think about that a little differently. Thank you for the question.
I really appreciate your lecture, and I have learned a lot about definitions of terms, and I've visited Buchenwald once and Dachau several times. So I've seen some of the evidence of what happens when a people can look at a certain population and say they are not deserving of being alive. Mm-hmm. And I've seen the ice boxes where they put people, Russians and Jews and handicapped people, and said, we can do anything we want with them because they're not really human beings. Mm-hmm. Your lecture did, however, bring to my attention a population right here in the good old United States of America of people that are being killed because they are. And the topic is called abortion. Mm-hmm. And as I listen to what you said, and we talk about other countries all over the world who are killing people who have not done anything, we in the United States, with federal funds, are paying for babies to be killed in the order of tens of thousands, and it goes into millions over the years. Do you have any comment about that?
No,
Is that the term of genocide? Does that be applied to a 6 or 8 month old baby who hasn't been born yet?
I don't think it does, and it certainly typically isn't within the academic community. And I respect your opinion on it, and I get that question often when I lecture about genocide, and that's a connection many people make with it, and I understand where your heart comes from as you make that connection. It's not something that I would classify as genocide. Again, for many people, there's a deep and abiding concern about it. For many other people, there's a deep and abiding concern about issues of women's rights, and I know that that's a large part of many of the political and social divisions we have. And again, I appreciate you trying to connect what we've talked about tonight with something that's obviously of concern to you, but no, it's not something I would place in the realm of genocide. Thank you. Yes, Therese, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I want to especially thank you for giving us hands-on ideas for activism, because that's often lacking in a lot of lectures on this topic. You said when you were speaking that we could bring this up during the question and answer section. Could you talk more about the factors that you focus on when you're determining hotspots across the world? Those that are more likely to encounter genocide?
Yes, I can, Therese. Gosh, that's just embarrassing. Somewhere in that pile there is. But what there are 7 risk factors. I can give you a sampling of a few of them. Yeah, one of them is whenever the ruling elite is a minority, that's the thing that puts a country at risk as well, because what the ruling elite has to do to maintain and hold on to power is very often do that in a heavy-handed way. So as you know well, because you travel to Rwanda with our students, the Tutsi power in Rwanda makes up 15% of the population. When you make up 15% of the population and you try to sell yourself as a democratic regime, that's hard to do because you're being voted in with 95% of the vote, but your people only represent 15% of the population. So that's where some of the controversy comes. So whenever a ruling elite is a minority, we have concerns about how they hold that power. Trade interdependence, economic trade interdependence is important. When countries are in economic relations with other countries, we think it gives them reasons to at least hold up a facade of being a fairly democratic, human rights abuses-free country. When they begin to cut off trade with other countries, it starts to look as if it's a very insular relationship. The most significant risk factor is actually prior genocide. When a country's gone down the road of having committed genocide previously in their history, they have a sense that it is a political tool that can work. In other words, if you want to exterminate or suppress a minority population, genocide can be something that's effective for you as an oppressor. So when a country's had that experience, I think it leaves them at risk for a couple of generations. I mean, very immediately, you see this in Rwanda today, you have people in the streets of Rwanda who have killed in the genocide. If a regime comes to power that wants to commit genocide again, the recruitment of perpetrators to do that is not a difficult task because you have a society that has a good number of people who have done that and are now walking the streets freely. So those are kind of some of the key risk factors that we'd look at. Thanks. Yes?
Hello. Thank you very much for your lecture. And I'm wondering what you think about the role of religion within genocide. Since you showed your Cain and Abel slide, I've been thinking of how the Abrahamic point of view relates to the genocidal point of view, considering that both of them necessitated the other and creating another, since you can't have a saved or a chosen people without having an unsaved or an unchosen people. So do you see any relation between those two points of view?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think one of the things I've worked on is the role of religion in genocidal violence, in part because when I interviewed perpetrators, I was just simply struck by how many times they referred to their own religious beliefs as justifications for why they did what they did. And again, what you would hope would happen, to go back to an earlier question, is religion is something that expands our universe of moral commitment, whatever religion it is, that it offers more inclusivity than exclusivity. But too often in genocide, I would argue, religion becomes part of the political process. Religious leaders want to be involved with political leaders, and they see that as a path to power. And religion becomes more, as you said, about defining who's out and who's in, rather than something that's a tool of moral inclusion. So I think many times in cases of genocide, and I think here specifically of Christianity in the Holocaust, of Christianity in Rwanda, of Christianity in Bosnia and Herzegovina, religion is used in some very disturbing ways to justify atrocities committed against victim groups. And in that way, the perpetrators come to see what they do not as only the right thing to do, but it's actually wrong if they don't do it because somehow they're not obeying what they've been told is God's command to kill. In Rwanda, some of the first convictions of genocidal violence were priests and nuns who were involved as perpetrators of genocide in luring Tutsi into their church compounds with the promise of safety and sanctuary, but then exterminating those very people who they lured in with the promise of safety and sanctuary. So I think, you know, it's very problematic to kind of paint religion as always the antidote to violence, when in so many cases it's been one of the causes, and certainly for perpetrators, one of the ways they've justified their own use of violence as well. Doesn't mean that religion ought to be just thrown out lock, stock, and barrel because it's been used that way. You know, absolutely not. If it's not religion that we're using to kind of draw that circle, I think we'll find other ways to draw it as well. But in a place where religion should be the voice of the voiceless, should stand up for the oppressed, we too often see it as an organization, as an institution, not fulfilling that role that it could fulfill. And it has done that some in Central America. But in Rwanda, Bosnia, Holocaust, we don't see it doing that as well as it should have, for sure. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Yes, I see three questions. Oh, I was looking for Michelle. I see three questions. I see one right beside you is probably the easiest, I'm guessing. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture, sir. At one point in your lecture, you said that you felt that, or that at least that some said, that genocide is becoming maybe becoming more common as the world's population increases and we become more crowded. What role does that play in risk factors, and what can be done about it?
The role that plays in risk factors is how it corresponds to scarcity of resources, okay? As we get more people, some resources become more scarce, or we don't put the effort into those resources as we need to. Africa is the most conflict-ridden continent in the world today. It's estimated that 7 out of 10 conflicts in Africa are over the scarcity of water. I have water accessible to me right here below the podium. Many of you brought water in. I see a couple bottles here in front of me. The scarcity of that resource in Africa is such that it lies at the heart of much of the conflict. If we can't marshal our attention and energies to try and figure out how to get water to these regions of the world that need it so desperately, that's a scarce, necessary resource that's going to underlie some of conflict. So where overpopulation relates to risk factors is primarily through this issue of scarcity of resources, and water is just one example of that. And part of it is also, though, I think applied to the relative ease with which people can get their hands on victims as well. In the Holocaust, for instance, 6 million victims from between 1939 and 1945. In medieval times, if you wanted to get your hands on 6 million people to kill them, you couldn't have traveled far enough to do it in your lifetime. So one of the other things overpopulation can do is it just brings the numbers of victims within the reach of a perpetrator, just puts that much greater numbers than it would be otherwise. But I think that's of less concern than is the scarcity of resources that very often corresponds with overpopulation. Thank you. Someone back here.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, you mentioned that the presence of UN military in Rwanda and Bosnia made the situation worse. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering what the reasoning is for that. And the other thing is, if something could be done also with education, like you do with all the other policy, with the military you do in the Auschwitz Institute, whether you also include then UN troops into that training and to the awareness.
Okay, good. Thank you for both those questions. I'll take the second one first. Just last week, I'm glad you mentioned that because I forgot to mention it. Just last week, the Auschwitz Institute has signed a agreement with the UN Office for the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, that from this point forward, when we work with government policymakers, we work with them as a dual institution. So our affiliation now will be with the UN Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide on everything we do with government policymakers in the future. And part of that agreement was that at least a quarter of every class we teach at Auschwitz in the future will be UN officials. So that's part of a group we're trying to reach as well. Your first question about the presence of the UN is a tricky one, because when the UN gets boots on the ground, they do so for the purpose of trying to maintain a peace accord, trying to enable humanitarian assistance. But when you look at it from the standpoint of the perpetrators, very often what the UN presence does is it allows them to gauge what the international reaction will be to their atrocities. The UN's mandate on the ground is always they cannot become the third belligerent. They can be present, they can brandish a weapon, but they can't fire it. They can't become the third belligerent in conflict. And the question is, when you have a presence like that on the ground, does it actually do more harm than good? In Srebrenica, Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims will say, absolutely, the UN was devastating because they told us, the UN said, you have a safe area, a safe zone at Srebrenica, a town of 5,000, thousands of Muslims fled to, because they were told they'd be safe there under UN protection. Over time, Bosnian Serbs began to throw rocks at the borders of Srebrenica, began to fire some shots over the head of UN personnel, and they pretty quickly learned the UN wasn't going to respond. And Bosnian Serb perpetrators will tell you, and I've had some tell me this in interviews, the last they saw of the UN was the backside of the UN as they ran. Because once the Serbs decided to take over Srebrenica, the UN left because they couldn't maintain the security any longer. When the UN left, what they leave behind are 30,000 Muslims who they rounded up for protection, and the Muslim community looks at the UN and says, you brought us here. You rounded us up, and you turned us over to the Serbs. Similarly, in Rwanda, 12 Belgian UN peacekeepers are killed in the first few hours of genocide in April 1994. And when they're killed, what's the UN response? We pull out troops to save them, for their safety. The perpetrators see that, and they see it's a field day for us now. We've pushed the UN, and we've seen what their response is, which is they will back away. So the issue is, will you put a force on the ground with limited mandate, or can you put a force on the ground that can respond to killing with force? If you're not willing to do that, putting a force on the ground with a limited mandate, both Srebrenica and Rwanda have suggested, is going to do more harm than good. And this kind of flies in the face of our sense that you get the blue helmets on the ground and everything's safer. In truth, sometimes it's not safer. In truth, sometimes UN troops have themselves engaged in some forms of atrocity. They've raped women. They've taken bribes for protection. So it's not always a sure sign that safety is going to be there. And I think that's where, we have to raise a question of UN troops on the ground, limited mandate, is that more harmful than it is helpful? And Srebrenica and Rwanda suggest it was, for sure. Yes, there's a question here and there as well.
First of all, thank you for your very thoughtful.
It's very kind, however, you're saying thankful. You don't need to do that. You can just go ahead.
I'm wondering if you'd follow up on that. Do you think there exists in the world today the will and the necessary agreement to change the nature and the mission of the United Nations? During the Iraq War, so many Americans voiced the opinion that, even if this was in some sense a good war, it shouldn't be our war to fight. And I often thought, could there be a United Nations with teeth? Does there exist the will and the agreement among governments and among people in the world? From your experience, do you think that agreement exists? And if so, what could such a United Nations look like?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think the agreement that is fundamental to the United Nations, the understanding that's fundamental, is state sovereignty. That states have sovereignty within their borders. Now, what we're having to learn is, does that mean that a state has sovereignty over killing its own citizens? And that's, I think, where the world is starting to turn and say, okay, state sovereignty, fundamental importance, the UN values it, we value it. I mean, most Americans don't want what they perceive to be a one-world government of some type, so we want the sovereignty of our nation. And we're willing to allow other nation states their sovereignty because we get to keep ours. But the question is, what happens when a state violates the fundamental basics of a sovereignty, which is protecting its own citizens, and it throws away the responsibility to protect, and in place of that begins to kill its own citizens? I think, and again, I'm going to go back and try not to sound Pollyannish, I see hope here. I mean, at least now we're starting to say and develop this norm called responsibility to protect, that's a fundamental state responsibility. And if you as a state decide to give that away, with it, you give away state sovereignty. Because we, the UN, will now come in and do what we need to do to protect your civilians. So that trade-off of state sovereignty is yours if you use it responsibly is, I think, an important conceptual understanding for us now. We didn't have that 10, 20, 30 years ago, maybe even as recently as 5 years ago. So I see a move in that direction. The difficulty will be, where do we draw the line on that? I mean, how much are we willing to violate state sovereignty? Are we willing to violate it because a state engages in female genital mutilation as a cultural practice? Is that fit within state sovereignty, or is that state giving away its responsibility to protect? So, I mean, genocide's a pretty easy case to agree on, but you start to see the slippery slope of, all right, if you're willing to intervene in state sovereignty there, how much further are we willing to go with that? And countries in Africa, I think, are most concerned because they're most at risk here. I mean, we have 6 cases right now before the International Criminal Court. They're all African. And some people are calling it the African Criminal Court, not the International Criminal Court. And the issue is, why does the world feel like it can step in so quickly in Africa when things aren't going well? They'd never want Africa stepping in their country when things aren't going well. So I think those are the things that start to unfold. But I can see, and I hope to see, a UN that has enough teeth to say, we're not willing to stand by and let a state massacre its own citizens. And again, very hopeful. We've got the International Criminal Court. We have an office now of the Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide. We're realizing what the right thing is to do. Your question brings us to the issue of, will we have the will and the heart and the commitment to do that right thing? And I think we will. I mean, I do think the people I work with at the Institute and the UN are the greatest people in the world. And I know their heart is in the right place. It's just, how far are we willing to go to violate state sovereignty? And we have to do that when a state has given away its sovereignty and given away its responsibility to protect. It's a good question. One more question, please. Michelle? I don't know. You pick. You pick. I don't go with Taylor's grandfather. Taylor's graduating. Her grandfather wants to ask a question.
Would you identify as genocide what we did in our treatment, Americans did 150, 200, 250 years ago when we deliberately infected their villages with sick non-Native Americans, primarily with smallpox, and just wiped out entire villages? Would that be identified as genocide?
You know, I'm very glad you asked that question because it's a good way for us to bring it home here at the end. I think absolutely so. I mean, the U.S. government never had, as government policy, issues of extermination of Native Americans. But in the late 1800s, in westward expansion, it was perfectly clear that if Native Americans did not choose to relocate, did not choose to go to boarding schools, did not choose to comply with every request, that the government and its troops were willing to resort to extermination. Now again, that's different than saying the government had a policy of extermination. But if necessary, the government was willing to engage in what some scholars have called genocidal massacres to remove Indians who fought removal, or who it was difficult to remove for some other means. You've mentioned one form of removal, the distribution of blankets deliberately infected with smallpox. There is some record of that, probably not as widespread sometimes as people think, but what's more widespread would be the systematic kind of genocidal massacres that we see when Indian groups particularly decided to resist relocation and the colonial powers that came with that. And we see, and again, it's part of what I've tried to do in working with perpetrators is to understand the reality that they are not so different from you and I in how they respond to atrocities and how they decide to inflict atrocities and the type of abuses and even the creativity of abuses in which military troops engage. One of the things I do sometimes when I speak is give an example of military troops who come across a victim group and they torture and rape the women, they kill the men, they excise or cut out the women's vagina and stuff it upside down on a saddle horn as trophy. They cut off the testicles of a male and empty it and sew it together to be a tobacco pouch, and just kind of ask who does this? Who perpetrates something like this? And as you would guess, very, very few people think of the U.S. cavalry in the 1800s. And they'll point to tons of other countries around the world where they're sure this happened, and they can swear reading about it somewhere. But if they've read about it, they read about it in this country 100-some years ago. And again, it pushes us to, again, kind of look back on our own responsibilities as citizens of this country and to recognize that, you know, if there's an antidote to genocide and mass atrocity, it's a fully functioning, stable democracy. We weren't that in the 1800s. countries today in political transition aren't that either. But if democracy is kind of the antidote, then part of our responsibility and part of our leverage is how we continue to nurture that democracy, recognizing that genocide's not an issue of other people's history. Genocide's also very much an issue of our history today and our place in this world today as well. So thank you very much for that final question, and I think I'm done.
Terrific. Before I bid you good night, I do want to invite you to two additional events. On April the 4th, I believe, our Student Honor Society in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Zeta Chi Rho, will be hosting a lecture at 7:00 p.m. in the Madison Street Lounge in the Student Center. Dr. David Wildermuth, a postdoctoral fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum this year, will be speaking on his current research, Bielica is Ablaze, the Wehrmacht, the War of Annihilation, and the Holocaust. And there's no cost to that, right, Taylor? It's free and open to the public, 7:00 downstairs. And then a week later, April 11th, we will be hosting here our Hildebrand Awards evening. We will be making presentations of the awards at a dinner preceding, and then at 7:00 on this stage, we will be presenting those award recipients and then hearing from Judd Newman, or Judd Newborn, who will be speaking on the topic, Speaking Truth to Power, Germany's White Rose Student Resistance. And that will be a rather special program. We invite you to return for that. As you can see, much happens in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College. Stay tuned for more events. Thank you, Jim Waller, and thank you all.